I'm Sheena, and this is Unusual Hobbies, a short podcast series where we talk to people about hobbies that are different and unique. Today I'm joined by Wendy Callahan, a most amazing woman, and she writes under the pen name of Jea Hawkins. Today we're talking about a fascinating hobby that she has, and she looks into genealogy. Wendy, thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited, and it's cool to actually hear your voice kind of like in person because I'm used to hearing it on the podcast.
So we're talking about genealogy today. Let's start off with the first question, which is, what is genealogy?
To put it very simply and very briefly, genealogy is the study of your family history and learning about your ancestors, who they were when they were born and died, who they married, where they lived, what they did. And that's basically it. Some people call it family history.
So it's like a big family tree.
Exactly, building your family tree, putting together pedigree charts, and some people like to see how far back they can go.
Pedigree charts is in for pets.
Kind of similar, yes. Where do you come from? Who are your parents and grandparents? And did they pass the good genes down to you? Did you get your bob's tail from, your grandparents on your mother's side?
Okay, so this is one of your hobbies. You spend a lot of time looking into genealogy. Is this just in your space, like your family history and so on, or do you do it for other people?
I do like to do it for other people because my family history, I've researched it for so long and to a point where there's pretty much not a lot to discover anymore. So, yes, I do work on it for other people. I still have brick walls for myself that I am working through, however.
So what's the most interesting thing you found out about your family?
Oh my goodness. Supposedly, and I don't know that this is true, supposedly my great grandmother's first husband was a rum runner during Prohibition, and he remains a mystery after the 1920s, so I'm still trying to verify whether or not that's true, but I don't trust most of those kinds of stories.
Where does that story even come from?
It usually comes from the grandkids who say, well, the reason so and so wasn't in our lives was because this is what he was doing. So I think really what happens is a person, in his case, for example, just runs off and leaves a family, and that gets, I think, conflated with a lot of kind of legendary ideas like, oh, he ran off because he was involved in rum running and illegal activities during Prohibition. And I don't know if it's a way for people to kind of feel better about a family member's abandonment of a family, or just that kind of story that gets passed down and people perpetuate it because it's really interesting.
That does make sense. So how do you separate fact from fiction then when you're working through all of this?
Mostly through records, particularly primary sources, your birth and marriage and death records that you can find on people, newspapers. If your ancestor was in the newspaper a lot, they just might have been trouble. Like I found out, well, I found out my great great grandmother was in court for assaulting a guy in 1910. I didn't even know that was a thing with women smacking people with jugs, but my great great grandmother did it, and I've got the newspaper article to prove it. But I have nothing on this other person, this supposed rum runner. So unless I find, a newspaper article or a court record that says, yes, he was in trouble, I take the story with a grain of salt. Just like people like to pass down stories that their great grandparents were Native American, that's a biggie, especially in the United States. Grain of salt, see if you can prove it, and there are ways to prove things like that.
What would you do if you wanted to get started figuring out your genealogy? Like, what's step one?
The very first step is you write down exactly what you know. You sit down and you say, this is me, this is when I was born, this is where I was born. You write down everything you know about your parents, grandparents, and so on. And then you go to your parents or aunts, uncles, grandparents, great aunts, great uncles, cousins. You go to them and you ask them the questions. Because a lot of times there's either someone who already knows a lot, or you can get little bits and pieces from different parts of the family.
So, like names of previous relatives and birth and death dates and that kind of thing.
Exactly. You just write down every little thing you know, and then talk to Great Aunt Mary, who will say, "Oh yes, my father, your great grandfather, served in World War One, and he died in France, for example." So yes, go especially ask the older generations, because once we lose the older generations, they're gone, unfortunately, and a lot of really interesting stories are gone with them.
Hmm. I don't know if this is the case in your family, but in my family, there was a tendency for everyone to have very similar names. So the mother, the daughter, everybody would have like a Maria in there or a Elizabeth, particularly in my family. I don't know if you find that then muddies the water somewhat.
It depends on the culture. I love that your family's like that because I know in my family we pass down middle names. So my middle name comes from my mother's middle name. Mostly the naming patterns aren't a big problem in the United States, but if there's a particular culture with naming traditions that are confusing, that can be tricky. I am very Italian, and one of the naming traditions in Italy is to pass down your firstborn son has the father's name, and then firstborn daughter has I think it's the mother's name. I'm probably wrong, so please don't take that as gospel from me, please.
Yeah, it's the same sort of thing in the Afrikaans culture, and the older generations tended to do that. So that stopped with my generation, thank goodness. Otherwise, I'd end up with all sorts of middle names. But but the older generations, that's exactly it. And so you say, so we'll literally be having a conversation, and we'll say Lani, and then we're like, okay, but which Lani? Because there's like 8 of them, you know.
That is confusing.
So nicknames then abound. So it ends up being like Wimbut, which translates into uncle brother, literally, and that kind of thing. So that's how,
Wow, uncle brother.
yes, that's the literal translation of it. It makes a lot more sense in Afrikaans. It's a cultural thing, I think.
I love that, though. That's interesting to me. So I'm going to have to dig in more just to understand better. I think that's really, really cool.
Well, good. I'm glad I could add a little spice to your life. Okay, so you have obviously a fascination with history.
Yes.
You've written at least one book set in a historical setting with a lot of research. Remind me of the title offhand.
As Long as Love Lasts, and it was nominated for a Goldie. Ah,
Well done.
thank
Well
you.
done. And the research in that and the way you wrote the time and the feelings of feeling kind of oppressed as women was remarkable. Right? So you obviously have a flair and a love for history. Is this why genealogy is so fascinating to you?
Partially. There's a very personal reason, and my parents divorced when I was about 3 or 4 years old, and my mother was not part of my life. So I just really wanted to know about her family. And I think I was about 12 years old when I started digging and digging and digging, trying to figure it out. And I finally got back in contact with my mother's family over the years, and it all sort of came together. And yes, in contact with my mom, we have a great relationship, but that was what kind of started it. I didn't have my mother's family to tell me these things, so I had to know. And it just became an obsession, I guess, from the time I was about 12 years old. And I really started digging in earnest when I was about 18. And I've been doing this for 23 years now. No, 26. Oh my gosh, I'm 44 minus 18. That's 26. Wow.
Your maths is really fast. Well done.
Thank you.
That's a superpower.
And I don't math well, not one bit. I did not do well in algebra in high school. I still remember that. I had someone try to demonstrate algebra to me with an orange, and I told them, all you've done is taught me how to divide myself by orange. So that's how good at math I am.
Well, I'm very impressed with your subtraction skills.
Thank
So
you.
well done. Okay, So it sounds to me like you got interested in the genealogy first, and then maybe the passion for history grew out of that.
Yes, I think that's fair to say because I know as a teenager, my interest in history did develop kind of after that interest in family history. I'm not ashamed to say I read a lot of zebra historical romances in the 80s and 90s. I was at the drugstore buying those all the time.
So I take it this is like the kind of paperback historical romances that you get in bulk, like it's easily available.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. They were very easily available in the 80s and 90s. And then reading them made me wonder because a lot of times the authors would include historical figures, like this woman might get involved with a king to, save her life or something. And so I was interested in who those kings were. And then I started reading actual nonfiction history outside of school, and that was a lot of fun for me. Every time there's an article about them digging up some deceased king or queen or duke or duchess, I want to know what they found and what they did with those remains. I'm always so curious about that.
And what do they do primarily with the remains?
A lot of DNA testing to prove who they are.
Huh.
Yeah, they did that with was it Richard the Third who was buried under they found his remains under a parking lot somewhere in England, and I think it was Richard the Third, and they did DNA testing to determine was his father, was his mother, and compared him with modern day descendants. So that was really fascinating to me.
Oh wow. And that also is genealogy, right?
Correct. That's a big part of genealogy these days is DNA testing. I know that I've tested it pretty much every site available. A lot of people are doing it. I don't know where you are. Do you get those advertisements on TV about DNA testing with any of the companies or not so much?
No, there's only one place I know of that does it here, and it's a university. So we have a very good archaeology sector, if you like, in South Africa because we found a lot of remains that are considered like the first human and that kind of thing. So we have amazing archaeology here. All right. So that they will do DNA testing for you. Here's my concern with DNA testing though. I wonder because there don't seem to be any regulations around what they do with your DNA. I don't know if I want people to have my DNA on record. I'm paranoid this way.
That's understandable because there are a lot of privacy concerns out there. I mean, should we put pictures on Facebook of us in a particular place, for example? I know when I go on vacation, I don't tell people I'm away from my house. I don't say I'm not home. So yeah, that's an understandable concern because who knows what they're doing with the DNA. I know in the United States they're working on enacting some laws regarding it, but right now you kind of have to trust the company's terms of service, which not everyone does, and I can understand why.
See, I really don't want a medical aid down the line saying I can't get medical cover for cancer because I have a DNA thing and some DNA test from somewhere. Do you know what I mean? Or that kind of thing. So until we have laws for it, I'm staying far away from those needles.
I'm the same way as far as I will not have my DNA tested for to check for health things because one of the popular services called it's called 23andMe. You can get your DNA tested for ancestry. You can also get it tested for health. I did not get the health portion tested. I don't need to know, for example, if I have the breast cancer gene. My mother had breast cancer and she fought it and won. My aunt on that side, my cousins on that side have had breast cancer. I'm not going to test for the gene. It's either going to happen to me or it's not, and I'm not going to have an insurance company say, "Sorry, your DNA says you have a high risk for breast cancer." I got a family history that says that. That's enough. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, exactly. So, but that's a whole other conversation because that goes down conspiracy
Oh,
theories and stuff. So let's not get sucked into that rabbit hole. Let's mosey back to genealogy. Okay. So you got started with this really young. Did you have like a mentor or did you just kind of fumble your way through it? Did you read on it? Like, how did you start?
I fumbled so much. I was all fumbles. I would go to the library and pull down books of passenger lists and stare at names and say, one of these must be me somewhere. This must be an ancestor, but I don't know which one. And then I think I was about 16 or so, and my grandmother pulled out this crumbling leather wallet that had photographs and family histories on her side alone, on her mother's side, and deeds, Civil War records from her. Let's see, he's my great grandfather who served on the Union side during the Civil War. And I was like, Grandma, I love you. And bam, that really just helped me get facts down on paper. But until then, I had no clue what I was doing.
And so when the DNA testing and stuff started becoming more popular, did you just jump on that bandwagon and go, oh my gosh, this is like what I've been waiting for?
I waited a little bit because early DNA testing was gender specific because early on you could only test Y-DNA, which is passed from father to son, or mitochondrial DNA, which is passed from mother to child. But mitochondrial DNA is considered deep ancestry, which means it's telling you something about your mothers, etc., thousands of years back. So it's not necessarily as useful for breaking through your genealogical brick walls, those questions you have that you haven't been able to answer. But I did take that mitochondrial test. And then when autosomal DNA came along, oh gosh, I've taken every single test that I can. Autosomal are the 23 chromosomes you inherit from your parents, and they inherited those from their parents, and so on and so forth, and you get them from both sides, those autosomes. And that's the testing that is very popular these days with genealogy.
And what does that tell you?
So, what autosomal DNA tells you is who you're related to. It's basically all it does. Doesn't tell you health information. It doesn't go far back, so it's not going to tell you if you descended from Charlemagne, if his DNA had ever, been tested. It's going to connect you with usually up to about fourth cousins. It can connect you to more distant cousins, but the odds of connecting, say to someone who connects to you back in the 1600s are a lot lower because of the fact that that autosomal DNA changes with each generation. Most of us have about 100% of our DNA from our parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and great-great-grandparents. But once you get to your third great-grandparents, you get fewer pieces of DNA from those ancestors going back.
So you do this test and it spits out what, like a bunch of names?
Correct. You get an ethnicity estimate, which I always tell people, please don't waste your money on an ethnicity estimate because they are not perfect. Because the companies they're comparing your DNA to a testing population that's pretty limited. They're not, for example, I said I'm Italian. They're not comparing me to every person who is Italian in the world. They're comparing me to kind of a smaller group and trying to figure out just where I fit in. So that ethnicity estimate can be useful, but I don't suggest spending the money just for that. And then yes, you get a whole bunch of matches, a whole bunch of cousin matches, or perhaps closer. You may get some surprises, and that is one way to help you figure out and answer genealogical questions you might have.
And the answers you get are based on other people who've also done this test.
That is correct. It was DNA that helped me determine my maternal grandfather's paternity, for example. We would not know who his father was if we had not taken me, my mother, my sister, and some first cousins. If we had not tested our DNA, we would not know the truth about who his father was. And
his father obviously did this test too.
No. Actually, my grandfather passed away before we got this answer, and my grandfather has never tested his DNA. His father passed away long before DNA testing was available. The cool thing about autosomal DNA is you don't need a parent or grandparent to have tested to determine who their parents were, because say your grandparent was an adoptee, and this is big for adoptees, and you want to find out who their family is, but that grandparent is deceased. You don't necessarily need to test them to get the answers that you're looking for. There's a lot of ways around that.
Because their DNA will be in
You.
their family down, right?
Exactly, okay. Exactly. So you're, in my grandfather's case, and this is from the great grandmother who was married to the supposed rum runner. She was a busy lady. She had, and I'm going to look at my files. She had 10 children. No, I'm sorry, 9.
Wow.
9 children. No, that's 10. No, that's 7. Let me see if I'm looking at the right view. She had 7. There we go. She had 7. I'm seeing half siblings because there are a total of like 10 half siblings because of all the men she was involved with. So she had 7. And the first one was from a guy, we have no clue who it was. It was just, she was pregnant. And so this other guy said, I'll marry you and raise that kid as my own. That guy who said he'd marry her was the supposed rum runner. He married her. They had 4 children together. And then she got pregnant with my grandfather after this guy split on her. So we were always told our grandfather was the son of a particular person that she married. And we were like, okay, sure. We took my mom and a whole bunch of us took DNA tests, and I said, Mom, your Italian percentage is way higher than it should be. And this is where an ethnicity estimate can come in handy. I was like, your Italian percentage is like double what it ought to be, because our Italian comes from my mother's side. And I was like, this is wrong. There's something wrong here. And then I said, who's this group of cousins that DNA has matched us to that all have the same last name and are all from the same place in Italy? Who the heck are these people? That's when I was able to dig in and find out that this particular man had been in the same place at the same time as my great-grandmother, and that was the father of my grandfather. Not her first husband, not her second husband.
Your great-grandmother was a busy lady.
She was so busy. She was getting busy. And I've heard she was a horrible person. I've heard, no, the state took her kids away. But then I've heard, no, she left her kids at the hospital she didn't want to have anymore. Oh,
wow.
So, but yeah, we figured that out. And so we were able to say, okay, Grandpa's dad was this man from this particular place in Italy, and we have second cousins on that side that help prove that, and it was a lot of fun to figure that out. Most of my family's taken it well, but like one aunt is not too jazzed about it. And that's the thing about DNA. I always tell people be prepared for surprises.
So have you reached out to those cousins? Are you guys in touch?
Yep, we have contacted some of them. The closest is a half first cousin to my mom and dad, and or not my mom and dad, my mom and uncle. If he was a half cousin to my mom and dad, that would be weird. To my mother and uncle, and he was just like, whoa, I guess my grandfather was not faithful to his wife. Okay. And so not everyone's happy when they find out those sorts of things. But for the most part, like the second and third cousins think it's really neat and are happy to be in touch with us.
That's cool.
Yeah.
That's cool. And that makes your Thanksgiving dinner table a little larger if anybody's around at the time, hey?
Yes, that would be an interesting family reunion, a whole bunch of loud hand-waving Italian people. So that's one of the reasons. So that was one of the other things about what got me started on this path, because, I mentioned before, my father raised me. I didn't have my mother, and he would always say, why do you talk with your hands? What are you, Italian? And I'd say, I don't know, maybe I am. And then I found out I was more Italian than I realized.
That's so interesting. So that's obviously a genetic thing that just passed on.
Yeah, apparently. I mean, my mom's side of the family is very, they do gesticulate quite a bit when they talk. And they're very huggy and warm and loving. And that's kind of a stereotype a lot of people have about Italian families, is that they are very boisterous and loving, and they, care about family so much. And that does seem to be true.
So you're right. I mean, it is interesting. This is interesting.
But like I said, do watch out for surprises. I mean, if someone does take a DNA test, you might discover things you did not expect. I discovered a first cousin I didn't know I had, which was ultimately awesome because she is the daughter of an uncle of mine who perished when a ship sank in 1982. And we had no idea he had a child out there. No clue. He never told anyone. And when we matched up on a DNA test, it was like happy tears for the entire family because he was like our favorite, brother, son, uncle in the family. So finding her was amazing. But I've also found a first cousin of my father who has freaked out. And she doesn't want to be contacted because she took a test expecting it to tell her she was 50% French, 50% Italian, because that's what her parents were. What she found out was she was 75% English. And she's like, no, 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 this is wrong. And I'm like, okay, well, you know what? Here's my phone number. When you're ready, I am here to talk to you. And I just left it at that.
So the moral of the story is don't lie to your kids because they're going to do a genealogy test and they're going to figure out your lie anyway.
Exactly. Please tell them if they're adopted at some point. Find a time to sit down and have some tea together and say, I have something to tell you.
Yeah, because that's harsh, eh? Just like discovering this way, it must not be fun.
No, I can't imagine how she's feeling because genealogists, those of us who are very into family history, we get excited when we see a new DNA match. We want to jump on you. If you are a very close match, we want to grab you and hold on to you and say, you are family. And some people don't want that. Some people take the test for the ethnicity estimate, or they take the test because they think it will be fun, and then they have a surprise, and it can be really upsetting. There's a lot of foundlings who have been taking DNA tests, so it's not just for genealogy or adoption. There's so many stories of foundlings in the 1920s and 30s and 40s just being left in a briar hedge somewhere and found and raised. And there's support groups now for people to take DNA tests to figure out adoptions and who their actual parents are, because then you have to reconcile, like, if you were adopted, how does my biological family fit into my life with the family that raised and loved me? So there's a lot of that going on, a lot of emotional conflict for people. So as much as people like me want to grab those new cousin matches and say, yes, I'm so happy I found you, they might not always be as receptive on the other side. So as enthusiastic as we are as genealogists, we have to step back and say, I understand. You found something you didn't expect. Big can of worms. Here's my phone number, give that out in like good faith that this is your first or second cousin, and just be ready for when they want to come to you.
You're listening to the Lesbian Talk Show. TheLesbianTalkShow.com, your hub of podcast information. What if you discover that you're like very closely related to like a serial killer or something? Have you ever heard of something like that happening? Dude, I don't know if I could handle that.
There's a TV show that called Relative Race, and it's on BYU TV. I admit I kind of avoided it for a while because that's very Mormon flavored, and I thought it would be very religious, and I'm like, I'm not watching the show. But then I decided to watch it, and one of the people was told she was related to Ted Bundy, and she looked like she just wanted to run far, far in the opposite direction. And then the guy was like, well, he was adopted into the family, so you're not biologically related to him. But when he brought the name up, oh my goodness, the look on this woman's face was, no, please don't say that to me. I think most people would either embrace the kind of infamy of it or say, no, thank you. I don't want to know.
Absolutely, I can totally see that. Huh. So that's so interesting. Okay, so if other people want to get into this, apart from sitting down and writing down what they know, what? Is there like a society you can join?
Oh gosh, there are so many societies. There are many lineage societies. For example, the General Society of Mayflower Descendants, for those of us who have descended from the Pilgrims who came over on the Mayflower. But I would not jump to a genealogical society like that just yet, because the next thing I would do is do your research. People can look online at record collections. They can look on free websites like FamilySearch.org, which has records from all over the world. That's where I find a lot of Italian records actually on my family, but they have records from every continent. So you sit down, you gather those births, marriages, and deaths. You look at those censuses. Almost every country has a census, at least at some point, of their citizens. And you just start putting that fuller picture together, looking to see if your ancestor served in the military. Military records are really full of information, particularly if they served in the Civil War in the United States. You're going to find a wealth of information in pension records. So you just learn about the records out there, slowly work your way back generation by generation, see what you find. And if you do happen to prove a lineage to a particular ancestor for whom there's a society or a particular country, then maybe you take the step to join a lineage society or visit that country to learn more. But I would just take it very slowly and not copy online family trees. It's really easy for people to get into the habit of copying online family trees and not verifying information. And there are known lineages that are intentionally wrong out there. There were actually scammers in the I want to say it was in the early 1900s, people who would make up lineages for people willing to pay to be told they were descended from like royalty and such. So be really careful about which family trees you're copying down online and verify everything independently. Find those actual birth, marriage, death records, those actual military records, actual census records, newspaper articles. Don't assume everything you find online is correct, please.
Do you think it's going to become easier or more difficult for future generations to figure out lineage? We have an abundance of information, but we also have an abundance of information.
I think right now is a really, really great time for genealogy or learning about anything in general, because yes, we do have a lot of information, but we still have physical libraries, and I seriously will spend hours in the library cranking through a microfilm still, because some things still aren't available online. And I think we're at a kind of a good midpoint of yes, everything is available online. No, not quite everything. Still have to go to the library for this or that. But I do think in the future, oh gosh, I think in the future it's going to be harder to separate fact from fiction. I mean, it already is now. Already is. So I think what's going to be most important is people using critical thinking skills and having a really good level of discernment in picking what records make the most sense, making sure that, yes, that's your family member, and making sure to verify hypotheses about your family and not just coming up with a wild guess and going, this must be it, and calling it good. So yeah, I think it could get a little harder to separate what's real from what's not if we're not careful.
Yeah, absolutely. It's easier today than ever to spread information, and that can be complete misinformation.
Oh gosh, yes. Oh my goodness.
Okay, do you have anything else you want to share?
I just want to say if you do take a DNA test and you have questions, look for people who can answer those questions. I'm always happy to answer questions and kind of help people out. But keep an eye out for reputable websites or Facebook groups that will assist you if you do that. Don't cling too much to the idea of certain family stories passed down. Don't be disappointed if you find out no, grandma was not a Native American princess. Don't feel bad, because what you may discover is going to be something else that's interesting to you. And, it may take a while to kind of come around to it, but sometimes the most mundane stuff is a little nicer anyway.
Certainly more believable. Not everybody can have a princess ancestor. All right, Wendy, you write as Jea Hawkins. Tell us about your latest book quickly.
Oh, goodness. So my last release was, as far as romance, was As Long as Love Lasts, which is a historical and contemporary romance novel that kind of goes back and forth between two periods in time when a woman and her wife find the letters and diary of a great aunt who was involved with a woman who worked for a circus. So that is also the book I'm most proud of.
And there's also a wonderful elephant.
There is an
in
elephant.
the story. You broke my heart.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Just so you know.
I'm sorry.
But the elephant was utterly charming, and the meet cute is absolutely worth it. And so you should run out and get the book. And where can people find you online?
So they can find me at www.jehawkins.com, and I'm on Twitter, not big on Facebook or anything like that, except under my real name, and mostly I talk genealogy there.
So if you're interested in the genealogy, you can find her under Wendy Callahan on Facebook. Otherwise, Jea Hawkins for the author profile and stuff. Now, Jea Hawkins...
You've been listening to Unusual Hobbies. Check out the links in the show notes for more information about my guest and to find our link to Patreon, where you can get exclusive podcasts and help us grow.
Talk to you
if you enjoyed this podcast, then please rate us, especially if you listen on Apple Podcasts. That's all for this episode. Have a hobbylicious day.